You are looking at a 2007 Toyota Land Cruiser Prado, equipped with a 3-liter 1KD diesel engine. It has a pretty decent mileage and it's broken. In this video I will briefly show you the condition of this car, the current issues it has, and I will also include some rambling about maintenance and common problems. By the way, most of the things I will talk about apply to the Lexus GX470 as well, since these two cars do have the same drivetrain, except the engine, of course. To fully understand the current condition of this vehicle, you should know the brief history of it. The first owner was using the car for long distances and he overhauled the engine. To top of that, he also replaced the whole gearbox. On the other side, the current owner is an elderly hunter, and according to his words, he is using the car until it stops. So for the past couple of years, the car was used mainly in the forest until now, since it kind of stopped. The exterior condition is actually not that bad. Apart from some obvious scratches and wear and tear, there really isn't much to talk about. Even though I would mention a couple of things. First of all, there are the headlights, which are in this case completely faded. The headlights of these cars are made entirely from plastic and they will simply fade, get worn over time. This is not only a visual problem, it also affects the already not good performance of the headlights, and as a bonus, like in this case, excessive headlight condensation can easily appear too. Another thing worth mentioning are the brakes, which in this case look pretty bad. This car was sitting still for approximately 2 months, so obviously the brake rotors are gonna be rusty. But there is a very high chance that the front brake caliper pistons are rusty as well, because rusty and seized front brake caliper pistons are one of the common problems of these cars, mainly if it was used on winter salty roads. So if you are buying one of these, then just be ready to have the brake calipers replaced or rebuilt. Lastly, I would mention another very common but just a minor problem. Yes, the exterior plastic door trim can often rattle like this. Luckily, fixing this is easy since the rattle is usually caused by broken plastic clips which are holding the trim in place. Let's finally check out the underside and the suspension. As you can see, the underside is dirty. The mud is stuck basically everywhere, which is the first sign that the car was used off the road. Then there are the broken and deformed underbody protection covers, which is again another sign of off-road use. But apart from these, the good thing is that the frame itself looks really good with minimal amount of rust. On the other side, the bad thing is that the stuck mud inside of the frame cavities is gonna help the rust to spread inside of the frame. So if you want to minimize frame rust, then you should definitely wash the frame from the inside regularly, mainly if you are using the car off the road. In this case, apart from the mud, the external side of the frame looks really good. Another thing worth mentioning is the transfer case, because on these cars you can often spot slight oil leaks from it. Usually the transfer case will be covered just with an oil mist on the surface. So if the oil is not dripping from the case and if the oil level in it is fine, then you can leave the slight fogging as is. However, if the oil starts to visibly drip from the transfer case, then it's better to fix this sooner than later. As you can see, in this case the transfer case is almost entirely dry except the rear part, where most probably the rear output shaft oil seal is leaking a bit. But this is still nothing to worry about. On the other side, the prop shaft U-joints are not looking good at all. Most of them are not only covered in dirt, but they are also completely dry, which is a problem. Long story short, this car has two prop shafts, the front and the rear, with U-joints at the end of them. These U-joints are immortal if you grease them regularly, but if you are not gonna grease them, then they will simply fail. In this case, the current owner had no idea about this, which is not that surprising. But what is more surprising is that the funny mechanics he trusted had no idea about this either, or they were simply lazy to grease these U-joints, or they simply like to be stuck at the bottom of a bottle. Either way, if you look at the rear U-joint on the front prop shaft, then you can notice that this one looks fine. Yes, it looks fine, because the old one was in such a bad shape, they had to replace it already. All in all, you should grease these damn prop shaft U-joints at every oil change. It's not rocket science, and you are gonna make the U-joints immortal. What more do you need? On the front part of the suspension, the things start to be more serious and more hilarious. Those of you familiar with these cars already see the first problem on this right side. But for those of you who can't, let me put a picture of the left side here as well. Yes, the shock absorber is broken. This is not a common widespread problem of these cars, but occasionally it can happen. Using the car recklessly off the road is gonna increase the likelihood of this issue as well as the worn bushing of the shock absorber. However, replacing the shock is not that hard nor that expensive, but it should be of course replaced immediately. Another thing which should be replaced are the inner driveshaft boots on both sides. They are already visibly cracked, so it's just a matter of time when they will disintegrate completely and let the grease out. Next, there are the lower control arms. They can easily last more than 300,000 kilometers on these cars, but I don't know if these were replaced in the past or not. Well, they certainly don't look like new or recently replaced. Either way, it would be definitely a good idea to check the ball joints on them for play and closely inspect the bushings on them for cracks as well. In this case, I had no time to inspect them more closely, but the ball joint rubber boot looks dry and cracked on both sides, which is not a very good sign. The last and most expensive issue in the front is the completely leaking and completely worn steering rack. By the way, a slightly leaking steering rack is a very common phenomenon on these cars, which you can notice by looking at the steering rack boots. If the bottom half of the boot looks suspiciously dark, or if it looks very dark almost entirely, with an oil mist on the inner tie rod, then your steering rack is leaking oil. Usually the oil leak is very small and usually it's not gonna get worse anytime soon. So in this case you should just check your power steering fluid level regularly. However, in this particular car, the oil leak from the steering rack is so bad that after filling up the power steering fluid reservoir, the oil starts to immediately drip out from the steering rack. Mostly through the left boot, as you can see, but the right boot is filled up with oil as well. Because of the lack of oil and because of the also worn steering rack, the steering on this car works like this. It's very hard to turn the steering wheel. It feels like it's jamming and there are obviously the noises. By the way, the jamming can be also caused by the worn steering shaft, which is connected to the rack. So, while replacing the steering rack, which has to be of course replaced entirely, the mechanics should also check the steering shaft. Lastly, let's quickly check out the rear part of the underside. Again, as you can see, it's full of dirt. On this spot the body floor starts to rust a bit, and as a bonus, there are some suspiciously hanging wires here and there. But overall, compared to the front, this whole part looks fine. After all this, let's also briefly check out the interior, which is in a surprisingly good condition. You can't see it properly, but all the seats are in great condition, partly because these are cloth seats and partly because they have these horrible looking covers on them. The steering wheel is in a great condition as well, despite of the mileage. On other cars with this kind of a mileage, the leather is usually very worn on it, but maybe the steering wheel was replaced in the past, who knows. On the other side, what is definitely original is the shifter head, which is completely worn, as you can see. The dashboard is still in a good condition, but it already starts to crack around the instrument cluster. This is a common problem on these cars, so it's more or less inevitable. Apart from the condition, the interior has more or less a standard equipment, so there are no heated front seats, power front seats or the retro touchscreen multimedia system with hilarious graphics. Obviously, the standard radio with a cutting-edge CD player and with a cassette player is not an advantage either, but it can be at least more easily replaced with an aftermarket head unit. Last but not least, let's check out the well-known 1KD 3-liter 4-cylinder common rail diesel engine. It can in many cases last more than 400,000 or 500,000 kilometers, but not always. Not always, because without proper maintenance or with a bit of bad luck, it can easily break much earlier. As I said, in this particular car, the engine was already overhauled by the first owner. Unfortunately, I have no idea what exactly was the reason for the repair, but I have a couple of tips. I think it was either because of a cracked piston or because of a clogged oil strainer. Either way, it doesn't matter anymore, but if you are curious about these problems and how to avoid them, then definitely check out the video I did specifically about them.
Give me a break!
But back to the car. The current condition of this engine seems good. Almost. I mean, it starts and runs good on idle. After checking the ECU for fault codes, I found only a fault code for the coolant temperature sensor, which didn't come back after I deleted it. And the injector values are also not the worst in the world, even though on the 4th cylinder it's not very good. Preferably all of them should be under 2. But I'm not a big fan of evaluating the injector condition through these values anyway. So all in all, I'm not really concerned by these things, but I'm definitely worried about one thing. A blue smoke from the exhaust on the first startup and an oil smell from the exhaust this car had. This is most probably caused by the leaking injector washers and seals. So there is a very high chance that one or more injectors in this car look like this. This condition is pretty dangerous since the contaminated oil with soot gets into the oil pan and right onto the oil strainer. A clogged oil pickup strainer will cause loss of oil pressure, which will sooner or later cause a destroyed engine or first a destroyed turbocharger. So I would immediately drain the oil from this car and check the oil strainer through the oil drain hole. If the oil strainer looks good like this, then it's most probably not clogged. But if it looks like this, then it's definitely clogged and you should immediately remove the oil pan, clean the oil strainer and also replace all the injector seals and washers.